Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I think this is perhaps one of the largest crowds that we've had for the Enlightening Lunch in these 2 years, which is great. Since it is a large crowd, I will introduce myself a little bit more formally. I'm Dave Gustin. I'm the Associate Vice Provost for Discovery, Engagement, and Outcomes within the Global Futures Laboratory, the former Director of the School for the Future of Innovation Society, and I am the instructor for HSD 610, which is the doctoral seminar for the Human Social Dimensions program that in part is at the root of the Enlightening Lunch. This is our second Enlightening Lunch of the semester. We'll have a third one, but actually no fourth one because of the other things going on that I'll want to invite people to, including my class. But it's a real pleasure today to introduce Arun Agrawal to you. Arun actually visited us, before the pandemic as well. It was now almost 2.5 years ago.
Just about a century ago.
And he is back. He'll be spending the next several weeks or so visiting with us. For those of you who need to know, Arun is at the University of Michigan, where he is where he is the Samuel Trask Dana Professor within the School of Environment and Sustainability. And he, like me, is a political scientist by training. Perhaps unlike me, he owes a little bit more allegiance to that discipline, but I don't think that much. And
beat it out of me.
I want to point out with Andrew Maynard on our faculty, with Diana Bowman on our faculty, with Dominic Bednar coming to us as a presidential postdoc, it seems like the University of Michigan is something of a farm team for the School for the Future of Innovation Society. While Arun is here this semester, he'll be exploring all sorts of kinds of opportunities and collaborations. The core of his work is in sustainability and development. He's also interested in issues of food and agriculture, and he has an emerging interest that I was really pleased and excited to hear about in the sort of nexus of risk and futures and anticipation, and how that plays into questions of sustainability as well. So as a regular Enlightening Lunch, the floor will be Arun's for about 25 minutes or so, and then we'll have generous time for question and answer, and I will leave it to Arun.
Thank you very much, Dave. And friends and colleagues, it really gives me a lot of pleasure to be here today, although I must confess that at the very least, I feel like an imposter to be presenting anything in a seminar titled Enlightening Lunch. I'll leave the enlightening part aside, and there is no lunch, so clearly it is not quite enlightening lunch. Nonetheless, Dave, my heartfelt thanks to you to invite me to present some emergent thoughts about research at the intersection of sustainability and development in your course. I had actually wanted to talk a little bit about some of the thinking I'm currently doing on the relationship between the present and the future, and how everything we do in the present is connected to the future by some causal relationship we at least implicitly hold in our minds about what it will lead to, everything we do and what its outcome will be. And therefore, everything that we do, in essence, is also risky, because the future, even if we think we know what's going to happen, doesn't necessarily turn out the way we want to. And that then raises questions of how to think about risks that we face, both in our everyday lives, but also through catastrophic changes in what happens, and even the possibilities of extinction or existential risks. But that thinking is too underdeveloped to burden you with it. So what I'm going to talk today is really about something that I have been working on for longer, although I can't say I know it better. And really in the context of this relationship between sustainability and development. What I want to say takes seriously the ambition of both sustainability and development to be about the environmental, the economic, and the social. What I say will also talk a little bit will also be a little bit about the importance of change, the change in where we are and where we want to get to, and the need to understand change better. And writing on sustainability, almost by definition, are also about trying to be useful. Because we define sustainability in a way that makes it very difficult to be only abstract, only at a conceptual level. So all of these issues, how to connect knowledge to action, how to think about the relationship of sustainability to development and its internal, not necessarily contradictions, but the plethora of meanings that it relates to. All of these issues are central to thinking about sustainability and development, and they're particularly important as we consider how it may be possible to avert impending disasters without increasing the crushing burden on the poor or the marginalized groups, and without worsening further the polarization and inequalities that mark contemporary society. So to refer to an early reflection on sustainability, Robert Cates offers the broad framing for sustainability as a sustainability science, as an approach to, or as a body of work that centrally seeks to understand the relationship between human well-being and nature or environment. It seeks to do so certainly to advance fundamental knowledge, but also to influence outcomes through knowledge and engagement. In these different facets, understand the relationship between humans and nature, advance fundamental knowledge, engage and influence the world. Sustainability and sustainability science are closely aligned with the goals of sustainability and development. There are, of course, many other frameworks that emphasize both the social, the economic, and the environmental. For example, work on common property, on coupled systems, on ecosystem services, and a whole range of environmental subdisciplines of economics, political science, and sociology. So these three different facets of sustainability are then related with different emphases in these various approaches. But in many ways, so let me start. So, in many ways, sustainability, not in many ways, almost inescapably, sustainability is about the social, the environmental, and the economic. And the same is true of development, and I will come to that very briefly. But I just want to lay out some signposts for what I'm going to do today, and it's really more of a conversation than a finished talk. The talk has 4 parts to it. In the first and second, I will talk a little bit about the apparent tensions of sustainability and of development, and then elaborate how these tensions relate to the need for a deeper understanding of trade-offs and co-benefits, or trade-offs and synergies. In the second half of what I say, of the conversation, I want to focus on 3 additional needed directions in the research agenda at the intersection of sustainability and development. One, the need to understand societal transitions, or the development or the need for transition science. Second, a more direct understanding of the factors that prevent action related to new knowledge and action, the relationship between action and knowledge, action and science, and how that can be addressed. And finally, the importance of synthesis to advance what we know about the relationship between sustainability and development. Much of the knowledge we have about both sustainability and development is fragmented across the social and ecological sciences. And this makes the critical importance of a synthesis science all the more prominent. So the main message of what I want to, that I want to convey is that a greater intellectual investment in and development of the analysis of trade-offs and co-benefits is ASU's internet access is asking me to sign in. Sorry about that. Okay, yeah.
You can try this if you.
Nah, it's okay. I don't need it, so there's just a pop-up message. So The main message I want to convey is that it's critical to understand and analyze better the relation, the trade-offs and benefits associated with sustainability and development, to think through what will enable societal transitions and translation of knowledge to action, or indeed the other way around, from action into knowledge. And then integrative social synthesis science. All of these are central to meet the hopes of the nascent or the long, to meet the hopes of the field of sustainability and development, of which the intersection is nascent, but each of sustainability and development have a very long history. So let me first talk about the key features of definitions of sustainability and development. And they are testimony to the complexity of what these two terms mean. The first, so let's first consider sustainability, and there's an explicit appeal in sustainability definitions to time. And so perhaps the most common or most well-known definition of sustainability from the Brundtland report focuses on this trade-off over time, and it says sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This idea of sustainability being about the ability to support and maintain the well-being of present and future generations can be criticized for being too anthropocentric, not focusing enough on non-human entities, including perhaps inanimate objects. But there is no necessary reason to think of generations or the need of the present only with reference to humans. So the basic appeal to trade-offs over time is a central part of how we understand sustainability. The second aspect of sustainability similarly defines the non-human more, identifies the non-human more explicitly and is visible in the appeal to the three different pillars of sustainability, familiar pillars of sustainability: the social, the environmental, and the economic. And even more so in the effort to focus both on the human and the natural, the social and the ecological. Social and the ecological. Understanding socioeconomic and environmental outcomes is critical, therefore, to understanding, to developing a knowledge of trade-offs between these fields. Without better knowledge and understanding of the empirical patterns of socioeconomic and environmental outcomes associated with changes in different drivers, the science of trade-offs and benefits will remain elusive, and our intuition about what sustainability means will be captive to thinking just in terms of linear or curvilinear relationships between the environmental and the economic and societal. This feature of sustainability definitions also explicitly points toward the need for interdisciplinarity when pursuing new knowledge in sustainability science. So just as sustainability is inescapably about the social and the environmental and the economic, and therefore the need to understand trade-offs and benefits among these outcomes, development today has become far more than what it used to be or what it was, where concern with economic well-being first became consolidated in the idea of development. From broadening towards inclusion of concerns with equity in the 1960s in the form of minimum needs or equitable development or human development, and then the concern with the environment, the meanings of development have proliferated. So today, whether it is bilateral funding agencies, whether it is the World Bank, whether it is governments, when they talk about development, they almost inevitably also talk about sustainable development. So development in some sense has become synonymous with the concern with the environment. Concern with climate change, biodiversity loss, green economy, circular economy, bioeconomy, all are part of development. The social became an integral part of development early in the history of development, but today, as the World Economic Forum, insurance companies, large consultancies, corporations, and so on, focus on economic change, they are also simultaneously concerned with what the consequences of these will be. At least rhetorically, they are concerned with what the consequences of the pursuit of economic growth will be for the environment. So it was difficult to separate this concern with the environment from development. So if the social and environmental and economic consequences of development and sustainability policies all always work in the same direction. That is to say, they're all kind of positive correlation with each other. You wouldn't need to worry about trade-off, because to achieve one outcome would be synonymous with achieving all the other outcomes. But as we know, the greatest market failure in the history of humanity demonstrates that they don't always work together. Right? So that's what makes the importance of understanding trade-offs and benefits so necessary or so visible to us. So, stated thus, the terms of the agenda for work on sustainability, for research on sustainability and on development are both minimal but also very broad. They highlight that effective research on sustainability and development should include a concern with the social, the economic, and the environment. Right? They should always include a concern with the social, the economic, and the environment. And they also suggest that if research at the intersection of sustainability and development does not attend to the social or the economic or the environmental, it is effectively ignoring what sustainability and development are about. Right? So if you focus only on environment, but only on development, but only on environment or the economic or the social, and I'm going to make a bold claim, but you can do so in a seminar setting. If you don't look at least two of these, if not all three, and if you don't look at the patterns of trade-offs and co-benefits in these outcomes, you're not doing work on development, you're not doing work on sustainability. Okay? So you can beat me up after we finish, after I finish talking. Because if it is true, then much of what we call research on development or research on sustainability is really about something else. It is not about sustainability and development. So, at one level, this seems, given the definitions and the proliferation of meanings of sustainability and development, this seems rather minimal demand. That if sustainability is about the economic, the environmental, and the social, or about trade-offs over time, we need to attend to these and work on sustainability. But similarly, development is about the social, the environmental, and the economic, starting with the economic, and then the social, and then the environmental. But you focus only on the economic, you're ignoring what you assert is the meaning of development. So it's a minimal demand, right? And it can be met empirically by focusing on both social, economic, and environmental outcomes of some cause, of some drivers, whether environmental or economic. Focusing on multiple outcomes of some drivers also would allow for an assessment of trade-offs between the economic and the environmental outcome, between the social and the environmental, or between the social and the economic, thereby appealing centrally to the relationships that sustainability or development are about. Indeed, if one says they're working on sustainability and development, it's reasonable to expect that one would be concerned about these three different dimensions of sustainability and development or trade-offs over time. So research on sustainability and development should be informed both with a concern with social, economic, and environment. It should be commonplace, but in reality, it is anything but common. So I talked about a few pieces of research that do look at this, but let me ignore that since I don't want to speak for much more than 20, 25 minutes, and go to maybe an illustration of how much of the work on sustainability and development is really only about a particular dimension of the outcomes that we think about as being relevant to sustainability and development. So I serve as an editor on the PNAS Sustainability Science section, and when I was deciding whether to accept that position, I was talking to Bill Clark, who founded that section. And I asked him, hey, how many of the papers you get, how many of them are looking both at least two of these outcome dimensions, and looking at trade-offs and for benefits among them, positive or negative synergy between them. And he said no more than 5%. And so, having served in that role now for this my fourth year, I would say that 5% is an overestimate. It's actually much less than that. I worked I served as the editor for World Development. We used to, towards the point where I stopped working as the editor, stopped being the editor, we got 4,000 papers that year. So, but overall, we would get anywhere between 2,000 and 4,000 papers, an increasing trend over time. And I would say no more than, most of those papers are about either development or sustainability. And most of the papers did not look at more than one outcome dimension. So if you're not looking at more than one outcome, they're looking only at one outcome dimension, it's not really possible to examine trade-offs because trade-offs are about more than one dimension, right? So the rarity of both social and environmental assessment or socioeconomic and environmental assessments of drivers may be attributable to, why is it that we don't see more work on this? And it may be that we don't have enough theories that throw light on how to connect these multiple dimensions of social environmental processes. It may be because we don't have enough data. The last seems unlikely because really there's a flood of data now on environmental and social and economic. If anything, there's not enough data perhaps on equity or on social dimensions. There's just a tremendous amount of data that is overwhelming us, right, in thinking about both sustainability and development. But we do lack careful theory. Now, think about theories that simultaneously provide an insight into a concern with economic and social and environmental. You know, the obvious thing that comes to mind is the Kuznets curve, which is not really a theory, it's an observation of an empirical pattern. Or the environmental Kuznets curve, which is the same. You don't really have a theory that underlies the pattern that we see, the curvilinear pattern that we see and is asserted between social and economic or environmental and economic outcomes. So we clearly lack theory, but how do we then advance knowledge at the intersection of sustainability and development? It's one way, or one important way, would be through more careful, more rigorous, more well-founded, well-founded in evidence-based analyses of that relationship. And however, that is missing for now. So I'm going to stop, and therefore it is. So that's one part of the research agenda, or at the intersection of sustainability and development, that we need to attend more carefully, more insistently to the relationship between social and environmental and economic outcomes, and to try to understand why, in some cases, under some circumstances, we see improvements in all two or all three of those dimensions, and others we see trade-offs, and in some cases, it also happens that we see declines because of some intervention. We see declines in all three aspects of the outcomes. So I'm going to shift now to the three other aspects of what I'm calling a research agenda at that intersection. The first is what I'm calling a science of transition. Over the last 2 centuries, societies have undergone multiple social and environmental transitions. From the rapid changes in agriculture in England between 1750 to 1850 that we collectively today call the agricultural revolution, then the industrial revolution and subsequent efforts by ex-colonies to achieve similar structural transformations, the pace of change today has never been as fast. And our frameworks and theories to understand and represent these changes have never been as inadequate. Work on sustainability and development is centrally concerned with the nature of changes in coupled systems and the larger trends and transitions that provide the context within which these coupled systems change. The urgency for understanding transitions stems from the normative agenda for learning about transitions. We are on trajectories of change, whether it has to do with climate or with biodiversity, the ecosystem, social inequalities, social organization. We are on trajectories of change whose likely endpoints are disasters if we don't shift, if we don't move from business as usual. And where else can you say the sentence without fear of being challenged than at ASU. The absence, therefore, of theories of social ecological transformations is thus a tremendous blind spot in the work of sustainability and development. A step towards addressing this gap would be to learn from the vast bodies of work that exist on the major transitions that different societies have undergone, and understand the pitfalls of trying to use history as a guide for thinking about future. We don't have a better guide. So at the very least, we should try to understand what happened in these historical transitions. Such socio-environmental transitions in the past share much in common with what Taylor Scott argues are general characteristics of social revolutions: rapid, basic social political changes, consolidated by changes in institutional structures of a society. Socio-environmental changes of the kind I'm talking about, or transition of the kind I'm talking about, they are about similar changes in the relationship of social actors to their environmental and their social context. Some of the key transitions that one can cite easily, or that match the features of agricultural structural transformations, of course, are agricultural structural transformations, but of course also forest transitions, demographic transitions, energy transitions, nutritional transitions, urban transitions, all of which are in the process of becoming. They're not ended yet, right? And in many cases where you see transitions, you also see features of the past continuing to exist. I think Marx talked about something about the incubus of history sitting on the chest of the present. Now they're also sitting on the chest of the future. So it's not that when you have transitions, everything changes immediately or completely. You simultaneously have features of the past linger. But to understand why these deep structural changes are occurring, what they portend, what they imply, what they tell us about multiple social relationships, individual and social practices in relation to the environment and our social context, institutional shifts that both result from these transitions and also consolidate these transitions. All of these need far more attention for an understanding that is not just about what happened in the past, but what can we learn from those changes that happened in the past about what could happen in the future. So for a stronger, for better research, for more effective research at the intersection of sustainability and development, I would argue it is necessary to learn from the common features and also the differences, the overlaps and the variations that characterize these transitions, the different ways in which different societies have experienced them. Like the agricultural revolution in England is not the same as the agricultural revolution in Mexico or India or China. So the different ways in which societies experience them, and thereby their different drivers and objects. There's little chance that such an account of transitions could develop without interdisciplinary work. The second source of insights into transitions, or what I'm calling transition science, could come from long-term intergenerational studies of major socio-environmental changes that have occurred around specific social environmental relationships, or in particular cases. A few examples in no particular order are the English Common Field System, the Green Revolution in India, the Dust Bowl in the United States, water regime changes in the Nile Basin, and I can just go on and on, right? There's so many examples historically where a long durée study of what happened in the social, the environmental, and the economic could give us tremendous insights into thinking about why transitions happen, when do they get consolidated, when do they fail, and what can we learn from them about the future. Evidence about these cases comes less from these long durée cases comes less from integrated qualitative causal analyses, less from that, more from in-depth comparative work. And the evidence that we do have comes mainly from economic and environmental historians and some anthropologists. But these writings are often deficient in the focus that any individual study places on the environmental or the social. They are often much more careful in thinking about how did the economy change. Less so, what were the attendant connections of economic changes to environmental shifts. So we know that as part of the agricultural revolution in England, there was tremendous deforestation. But the work on deforestation in England and the work on agricultural revolution really occupy different places, different people study it. So we don't have a clear sense of how and when these related processes unfolded. So the three requirements for effective knowledge and theory development for understanding transitions are understanding of knowledge over time, attention to socioeconomic dimensions, and attention to the natural world. Typically, we get analyses today that cover only two of these three, not all three. So how do we address this gap? And this brings me to the final two shorter parts of the talk. One focused on implementation science and the second on synthesis science. So there's an emerging body of work in implementation science, especially in medicine and health. And this body of work is extending the knowledge of how societal and organizational uptake of scientific findings takes place. And what can you do, often for even very small shifts, what can one do to facilitate such uptake? Research on the co-production of science and policy, historicized through earlier contributions on action research, on participatory action research, on community-based research, provides another avenue of insights into thinking about when is it that science and science-based policies connect better? When is it that practice and knowledge connect better to science? When is it that implementation leads to information? Efforts at implementation get taken up and lead to change. Lessons from such research are urgently needed to inform a clearer understanding of how research on sustainability and development can be translated into practice. For example, there's a tremendous body of work that has emerged over the last 2 decades into randomized control trials for development action. Much of this research tends to be confined to specific experiments that researchers carry out. Its translation into policy is far more difficult than the ability of researchers. It's far less common than the capacity of researchers to undertake these experiments in relatively well designed research settings, relatively well designed research analyses, right? And so one thought might be, well, if you just translated the findings from these into action on the ground or into policies, we'd be golden. Such conclusions ignore the fact that in the 1970s, late 60s and 70s, there was a thriving body of work on experiments in development. And most of it went nowhere because these experiments that were being done in the late 60s and 70s were large scale. They were with government, in collaboration with government agencies. But translating their findings into shifts in policy confronted entrenched political interests, which meant that their findings went nowhere. So the contemporary excitement about randomized control trials and what they tell us about when interventions work only tells us about when interventions work when researchers implement them, not about when they work when policymakers might implement them. And that would only happen if they adopt them, and that doesn't happen because any large-scale adoption of new ways of doing things immediately confronts old ways of doing things. And these old ways of doing things exist not just because they're beneficial to everybody who does them, but because they serve special particular political interests. So lessons from a broad body of work that has tried to look at the relationship between knowledge and action are necessary to translate information and knowledge about sustainability and about development into practice. I was just recently looking at a paper that identified 87 theories that explain the connection between action and knowledge. And we are hoping to publish it very soon. But that's the kind of work we need to understand when, how, where it is that you could get a deeper or a better or a more reliable connection between what we learn and what we do. Finally, turning to synthesis science, knowledge about trade-offs, about transitions, about case studies that embody intergenerational changes in the socioeconomic and environmental dimensions, about the relationship between knowledge and science, is scattered across disciplines, studies, and data sets. Bringing it together to strengthen existing theories of change, to understand nonlinearities and discontinuities, therefore requires integrative and synthesis work. Such work can be accomplished in any number of ways. It is not clear that any single approach to synthesis dominates others. In medicine and health, we can identify more than 57 different approaches to synthesis and convert them into families of approaches. Our approach to synthesis is much less elaborated when it comes to work on sustainability and development. We talk about meta-analyses, we talk about systematic reviews, we talk about critical reviews, but we haven't explored the full range of what it means to undertake synthesis in the fields in which we are interested, in the fields of development and sustainability. Nonetheless, focus on the tools that we do have would provide a kind of synthetic knowledge, synthesizing knowledge about common features of what is known, and the focus on patterns of similarity across rigorously executed work, as for example in meta-analyses, would be very useful to think through, at the very least, what kinds of knowledge could be translated into practice. But critical reviews and syntheses that seek to connect dissimilar evidence from multiple sources regarding a particular case or phenomenon of interest are equally important to extend the knowledge of what happened and why in a given transition or in a given case of socio-environmental change. Such integrative synthesis science would help situate socio-environmental outcomes, socio-economic outcomes in relation to a larger context and reduce the patchiness and heterogeneity of our knowledge about the relationship between context and outcomes. If we are to move beyond where we are today, such shifts in what we know and how we think about what we know and what to do based on what we know are both critically important and necessary. So I'm going to stop here, and I realize I've talked a little longer than what I had hoped, but we still have some time to chat. Okay.
So Arun, I'll let you sort of field questions from here, and I've got participants on the Zoom where I'll see them raising their virtual hands, and we'll try to get them into the conversation as well.
I see a hand up there. Did you find on the side? Nathan, go ahead.
Okay, first of all, I would thank you very much for enlightening us with regards to thinking about how do we go on sustainability and development research, uncovering research on that area, particularly with emphasis on the trigger. I've never been comfortable about these three pillars: social, economic, and environment. Only because that emphasis always has been on economics, and then when you on environment, absolutely almost none on social. Can you talk about, because of your breadth of knowledge and so on, can you talk about why we still don't want to emphasize the social dimensions of this field as much? What's the discomfort here? Because this is a social science crowd, and this crowd might be that. How do we go about doing research?
Yeah, so there are two things to say about your question, Nathan. One, I'm going to make a bad joke about, okay, how many pillars do you want there to be? No, it's not three, but if you're not comfortable with three. But I think the point you raise is very important, because on the one hand, I guess one could say that at least in development, the concern with questions of equity and with the social came before development became interested. People who work on development became interested in the environmental, right? So we already in the 1960s, we were talking about how economic growth and how economic prosperity is not all of what development can be about. So there are very anemic kind of responses to that criticism, such as in the form of, basic, what is it, development with basic needs, right? So yes, you can focus on economic growth, but you also need to ensure that at least the basic needs of everybody are met, right? Many of the measures of inequality that we have today were developed by economists, right? So, and there are lots of different ways in which we talk about it, but a concern with poverty, whether it is operationalized through thinking about a poverty line, or a concern with what it would take to eliminate poverty. In some, I'm not saying talk about poverty the same as talk about inequality, but there is a concern with a group of households and individuals that are below the poverty. So some interest in. And then I think there is some work that would suggest that at least some economists are concerned with questions of inequality. Right? So, if you think about what are the three most, so we have a lot more knowledge about what to do about poverty. And we have a lot more programs in place about trying to address poverty, far less for equity. But if you think about what are the mechanisms through which you can address equity, right? So we set aside social revolutions because even during and after social revolutions, those who are at the bottom of the ladder get it in their neck even after the social revolution happened. Right? So I'm not saying social revolutions cannot address equity. Our experience of them has been that they don't address inequity. So in our everyday lives, there are two ubiquitous mechanisms through which we try to increase equity, right? Taxes and education. Taxes for the uber wealthy, education for the common person. So those are the mechanisms that we have in place for addressing inequality. To what extent they actually do so, that's an empirical question, right? But in everyday life, those are the two. Having said that, your question was not just about equity, it was about social, right? So, and there I'm in 100% agreement with you that we don't have too many mechanisms through which to address social shift. And some of that has to do with the extent to which when one tries to address the social, that is to say, issues of justice, you immediately run into what we call entrenched interests, right? What Matthew Olson would say is, are the institutions are a consolidated form of maintaining the status quo, right? So in that sense, and institutions are controlled by the elite. So in that sense, you run into all kinds of obstacles to changing social patterns, changing patterns of distribution, or recognition process like that. But another thing I would say that we don't have even take the most simple measure of justice or of social equity, inequality, right? If you look around the world, even at the country level, we don't have consistent measures of inequality, even at the annual cadence for all the countries in the world, even for the last 10 years. So we just don't have the kind of data, we don't have the evidence that would allow us to say whether a particular innovation, intervention, policy change in causal mechanisms led to a change in inequality, right? Why we don't have this data, that's a separate question. I'm just saying that we don't have this data, so our capacity to know what has happened, what happens as a result of what we do when it comes to inequality, the most kind of simplest measure of injustice, is extraordinarily limited. And as soon as you go to what was the case 10 years ago, what's the case at the subnational level, what are other ways in which you could think about even inequality, I'm just talking about the Gini coefficient, one measure of inequality. As soon as we go to different measures of inequality, let alone injustice, we are in a sea of ignorance. There is no data on it. There is no measure through which we have tremendous sophistication in talking about injustice. We have very little concrete empirical knowledge of what these different nuances of meanings of injustice have happened. So on the one hand, I think there is a tremendous barrier you confront when you talk about injustice, when you talk about changes in social, right? And those political barriers, entrenched interests. On the other hand, we have tremendous ignorance about even knowing what works to reduce injustice. Yes, we all have time and place specific knowledge from our experiences, but when it comes to talking about economic growth, we have so much knowledge. When it comes to talking about reducing inequality, reducing inequity, improving justice, we throw up our hands. So I don't know if this is an answer to your question, Nessa, but it's something that you need to work on a lot before we can even say how to address injustice. Yes, please.
I think somebody there.
Please.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk, and I really appreciate the call for a more holistic look at sustainable development, including social, economic, and environment. And yet I was waiting your entire talk for you to say something about technology, especially with your interest in these sort of larger changes and big shifts, and many would look to technology, both as a driver of change historically, but also looking forward, thinking about energy transitions and electrification, or thinking about gene editing and agriculture, or just even what we're seeing with the mobile technologies and what that, how that
Mechanical trees,
patterns, et cetera. And
Right.
so I just would love to hear your reflections and how you would incorporate, some kind of assessment of technology and innovation as it pertains to sustainable development. And then also the other thing I'm just really intrigued about is, in your look at the way that these things get siloed, right, and not handled more holistically. I was just wondering the role that different institutions play in keeping these things separated, whether it's like funders or NGOs or, different kind of governmental bodies, what role they might have in preserving distinctions that may no longer be super useful.
Yeah. So you're right. I didn't talk about technology, but I'm an equal opportunity ignorer. I didn't talk about technology, and I didn't talk about policy, and didn't talk about programs. I really didn't talk about any of the mechanisms through which one might enhance either synergistic or trade-off relationship between the social, the environmental, and the economic. Right? So I think of at one level, of course, technological change is an outcome, but the way you present it, or the way you mentioned it, it seemed to me you're talking more about technological change as a driver of these different outcomes, right? And so, I could talk about it just a little bit. As part of the field that I work on, I think there are far more engaged and knowledgeable folks, even in this room, who could talk about it more carefully than I can. But technology has a very particular relationship with each of these three different types of costs. And so I'm just going to channel Piketty, who talks about inequality and the relationship between inequality and technology. And his argument is that during periods of rapid technological change, you will see a major increase in inequality, right? Because technological change benefits those who are able to take advantage of it and those who push it. So I would say technological innovation without major efforts to add redistribution or attention to redistribution is likely to exacerbate what we will see as what nature calls a social injustice. Now, but the brunt of my argument was that it's not just one dimension of sustainability or development that we should think about whenever we talk about any driver, whether it is technology or policy or. So, I would imagine, and I think it's reasonable to say that technological change, and we're talking a really very broad brushstroke, technological change will lead to, and it has historically done so, lead to a net increase in the aggregate wealth and well-being of the society. How it is distributed is unlikely to be equitable. But I think the real question is, what does technological change do to the environment? How does technological change help us when it comes to environmental or ecosystem degradation or biodiversity loss? And I'm not sure that, I guess 2 points to make. One, I'm not sure that the empirical evidence on technological change leading, and the relationship of technological change to environmental outcomes is clear. But perhaps there's a distinction to be made in the effects of technological change at the individual versus the collective level. Right? And this is partly captured by the idea of Jevons paradox or the rebound effect, that even as we get technology that allow us to use some good or some resources more efficiently, the macro level effect of that can still be to accelerate and to increase the total amount of those resources that we use, right? Because we're using them more efficiently, they become less, the relative costs go down, and in the aggregate we use more of them. Now clearly that's not always true, and that's not the case with every instance of technological change, but it happens sufficiently often that we would want to be thoughtful or careful about how we are thinking about technological change. Now, clearly, the renewable energy, as you mentioned, renewable energy is technological innovations for renewable energy are going to be critical for if we are to reduce our emissions and if we are to address climate change. Right? And at the same time, we see, even today, we see global consumption of coal has not declined, even as many coal companies are going out of business. So it has remained kind of plateau. Certainly, we are using more and more fossil fuels, and without some or a much larger political effort towards making technological changes in the case of renewable energy more broadly adopted, we are not going to see an energy transition that reduces emissions. So what's my position on technology? I don't really have one because I don't work on it. I didn't talk about it because this is really I'm trying to think about the relationship between social, environmental, and economic outcomes as almost made necessary by the way we think about, or the way we conceptualize development and environment. But what about the role of technology in supporting more positive outcomes in all of these three outcome dimensions? Technology has a central role to play I'm not sure I can say something unambiguously about what role that is, what the nature of that central role is.
Thank you.
We've got a question or two from the chat.
Okay,
Um,
and then you.
and don't look at that clock as a guide to, that clock is slow.
Okay, I realize, yeah.
From Cynthia Pickering, to what extent have locally oriented management of resources withstood external and market pressures related to sustainability and development? How do contextual differences play a role in this?
To what extent do contextual differences in how local resources are managed play a role in sustainability and development? If that's the question.
That sounds okay, Cynthia? You still there? You wanna?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, I'm going to take that to mean that I interpreted the question more or less right.
Yes.
So I think one part of the answer is to say straightforwardly that how resources are managed locally, and I'm assuming you have in mind some form of renewable resources, is shaped by, is structured by both the choices of users, but also the context in which those choices are being made. These choices or these patterns of use have clear consequences for the social and the economic and the environmental aspects of sustainability and development that we have been talking about. But I would also say that for the most part, our analyses of how local resource use unfolds tends to focus on one or the other of these three different dimensions. So for example, much of the work on common property has tended to focus on two variations in institutional forms. And when do variations in institutional forms enable resources to persist, enable long-term sustainable, means long-term use of resources, and that means sustainability. They tend almost not to focus on what goes together with unsustainable, that is to say, use of resources that cannot be maintained long in the future. What goes together with unsustainable management in terms of questions of equity and economic well-being, right? So I would say much of the work on common property falls prey to the critique I'm leveling in this conversation. And that is true not just of interdisciplinary work on common property, it is also true of work in political ecology, in environmental history, pick the field that you're interested in. I would say most of these fields, researchers in most of these fields tend to pick the outcome that they value and therefore have relatively little to say about the relationship of the outcome in which they are interested to outcomes in other dimensions of sustainability and development.
Thank you for this excellent, provoking and overarching presentation. I wanted to, so I took away one of the conclusions I took away is that we need to rethink how we know about environment, social, and economic relationships, as well as what to do based on what I think this is kind of what you were concluding on. But as a provocation, if you allow me, can we also think about the assumption within that to some extent is that knowing is important for the action and decision making, and having worked in the world of climate change or even development, I'm not sure that we need more climate science as the solution to more climate action, or that we needed more randomized controlled trials, because a lot of those find out that the local bureaucrat matters. And we kind of knew that already. So to what extent then is knowledge itself part of the social framing set of that institutional structure, which is holding back that more just or more radical transformation, or it is in fact becoming the key to keeping the status quo.
Yeah.
And please answer that in -2 minutes.
There's 4 obstacles to action: lack of understanding, lack of knowledge, understanding meaning even knowing whether action is necessary. Once you know action is necessary, knowing what to do, right? Lack of resources and lack of political alignment. So we as researchers and academics tend to focus on the first 2. And we tend to not think enough about how widely and how often lack of action on any issue is because of lack of resources or lack of political alignment. Because the tools that we have to address lack of action focus on lack of understanding and lack of knowledge. Okay? So I don't disagree with you at all.
Incredibly concise answer.
You said less than 2 minutes.
We are technically over time. We have a great audience here and online still hanging out. Do you want to have some informal conversation afterward?
First of all, I want to say, no, I'm not going to say it. No, I'm happy to answer more questions and have conversation a little bit more, but it's really up to people.
You sure? Okay, then I'll go to one of the online questions from Pooja. Thank you for your talk. Question is about the SDGs. Do the SDGs incorporate the discussion on transitions and trade-offs that you mentioned in the talk? If not, how can we incorporate it to make these a site of knowledge making, included in these dimensions?
Good question. I think the SDGs, so the point I'm making about trade-offs and co-benefits, it's not just about development or sustainability. It's really a point about any multidimensional concept, right? So the SDGs don't have 1, don't have 3, don't have 4, they have 17 dimensions. And then you think about the way they are operationalized the targets. They have like, what, 169 targets? And then they have maybe 150 indicators for measuring progress towards the SDGs. So everything I say about sustainability and development also applies to the SDGs, because I don't see much effort in the SDGs to identify where there are synergies and where there are trade-offs between the indicators through which you measure progress towards the SDGs.
I just have a quick question in line with that question and what you said. My line is, I wanted to dig a deeper on knowledge to action, part of your talk.
Yes.
So I did a research where I tried to quantify synergy and trade-off between 3 sustainable development goals in context of well, and I identified varying levels of synergy, but mostly trade-off between climate action and access to energy. And my question is, when the knowledge is already there and when the knowledge is in the reach of, let's say, political power or people, how do we move about turning that into action?
So, as I was saying to him, sometimes we can't, as academics, we are not very well equipped to make change happen. And I think, just look at what happened in the last 2 or 3 years in terms of awareness of the need to act on climate. It's not us older folks who are out in the streets marching to make the reality of climate action more visible. Right? So I think what young activists did is worth learning from, right? What they did and what you learn from what they did is action is more important. Working to mobilize action is maybe more important, at least when it comes to climate action, than doing more research. Right? I mean, we can absolutely do more research and sharpen or make more precise our understanding of the results of different kinds of actions or the effects on climate emissions or for adaptation, but we are in a place where the marginal benefits of action, mobilization are far greater than the marginal benefits of research. But learning that is not going to shift academics to marching in the streets. We are still going to do more research because the costs to us of doing more research are much lower than being out on the streets marching. So don't look to academics for making action on climate change become reality, I guess is what I'm saying. Which is kind of depressing, but.
On that thought, let's go back to school. Thank you, Arun.